Episode 9, Ducks and Geese and Bounty Hunters. I flew back to LA and realized that it was going to cost me 3 times what my Riviera was worth to get it out of the parking garage. I took a cab back to my mother's house. We made a plan to rescue my car and carried it out the next day. At the parking structure, there were a number of booths manned by one attendant. You could enter on either side where the attendant would hand you a ticket. Exiting, you would pass the other way and you could pay. My mother and I drove to the airport. When we got to the booth, my mother put on a show of asking the attendant if she'd been in commercials or a movie. My mother said she looked so familiar. She was just becoming memorable to the attendant. We parked the car, went in the terminal, and had a snack. My mother gave me the parking ticket. She went back to the car and went back to the same booth. When she got to the booth, she searched in vain for the ticket. She said she must have lost it. Of course, the attendant recognized her and knew she'd parked there less than an hour ago. So she charged her accordingly, and my mother was good to go. I went to the Riviera, drove to a different booth with a ticket, paid a couple bucks, and left. I moved in with my mother on Horizon in Venice. She wanted me to be around, so my nephew had, a male influence in the house, and it was certainly convenient. I went back to diving urchins and doing the occasional deprogramming. Randy had stayed in Australia for a while, but eventually would come home with Meg. My mother had hosted a Tupperware party. A week or two later, the orders came in. Beth, the daughter of one of her customers, came to pick up her mother's order. I was on the way home from the dive boat, and my nephew begged her to stay and meet Uncle Jesse. Foolish girl. Sometimes, when it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's not a duck. We were hired by a father who said that his twin daughters were in a cult. Charlie, our deprogrammer, listened to his story, which was typical of so many that we'd heard. The girls had stopped speaking to the family, quit their jobs, and emptied their bank accounts. They had also started a new relationship with a pastor who was unknown to the staunchly Catholic father. The father told Charlie that the pastor had appeared to speak to him on the girl's behalf. Things got heated, and at one point the pastor said, "Get thee behind me, Satan," to the father. That and other indicators led Charlie to believe things were awry. We couldn't find any history on this group or other members, but from everything the father told us, we were sure it was a duck. The girls still kept a close relationship with their grandparents. The grandmother had been sick for some time, and she was often in bed. The plan was to invite the girls to the house on the pretext that the dying grandmother wanted to give them some money. She would be able to see them spend it and enjoy it while she was still alive. The plan was simple. Our white pickup van would be parked down the street inside of the house. The girls lived 15 minutes away. They said they would call Grandma when they left their house. We knew the car they drove, so when they made the call, we would contact our van driver on the walkie-talkie to give him a heads up. The girls habitually walked up the driveway alongside the house to enter through the back door, which opened in the kitchen. We enlisted the help of my soon-to-be wife, Beth, who was a nurse. Her job was to answer the door dressed in her whites. It was not uncommon for Grandma to be visited by nurses. Grandma's bed had been set up in the living room at the front of the house. I would be in the bathroom off the kitchen. Beth would greet the girls at the kitchen door and walk them into the living room. The father, Charlie, and Wolf would be in a bedroom off the living room. As soon as the girls were bedside, we would all come out of our respective hidey holes. At that time, we would call for the pickup van. The van would drive up the driveway with the sliding door facing the house. We'd come out of the house with the girls, load them into the van, and go to Hollywood, where the father had secured a safe house for the deprogramming. That was the plan. The girls called. They were on the way. We call our van driver. No response. We try a few more times. Still no response. I leave the house and head down the street to the van. I get there. It's locked, and Mark, our driver, is nowhere in sight. I get back to the house, fill everybody in on the situation. We try to figure out what to do now. We did it for a few minutes until I tell Grandpa to just write a note telling the girls that he had to take Grandma to the hospital and you'll call them later. We'll stick the note on the window of the kitchen door. We're running out of time. Grandpa gets a pencil and pad just as the girls park on the street. He's an old fella and his hands are shaking. He's having trouble writing the simple note. The girls are halfway up the driveway to the back door. I've got a piece of scotch tape in my hand ready to tape the notes to the window as soon as Grandpa's done composing it. As soon as he finishes it, I grab it, get him out of sight. I race to the back door, tape the note on the window, and drop to the floor just as the girls turn the corner. I hear them talking about the contents of the note. Then they turn around, walk back down the driveway, get in their car, and leave. We use the phone in the house to try to get hold of Mark, but to no avail. Everybody's in place. Every day that here, we're costing money. We have a good plan. We just didn't have a vehicle. We rent another van, move Grandpa's car out of the garage, and park it on the street away from the house so the girls don't spot it. We park the van in the garage. The girls originally came to the house around noon. We waited till 5, and Grandpa called them again. He told them it was a false alarm. There's no concern about Grandma. Could they come over now? The girls agreed. They show up, and this time everything goes according to plan. We're all in the living room. We have a mini family meeting. Charlie is explaining why their father has assembled us. He voices the father's concerns about them being in a cult. They say it's all untrue and that the only reason that they're here is because their father is a control freak and won't let them have their own lives. Charlie tells them that he still wants to talk to them, just to make sure everything is cool. He requests that we go to the van. They do it with no hesitation. I believe they just want to prove their father wrong. Wolf and I are in the back of the van with them. Remember I told you I could tell if someone's brainwashed just by looking at them. I look at Wolf, he looks at me, we both shake our heads. There's nothing wrong with these girls. We're kidnapping 2 ordinary citizens and we're in deep kimchi. When we left Mark in the van, we told him to sit on the mattress in the back and wait for our signal. Mark decided to sit in the front seat and listen to the radio. There had been a string of burglaries in the neighborhood. A neighbor spotted Mark sitting in the van and figured he was a thief casing their next target. He called the cops. The cops came and took him down to the station where they interrogated him for the rest of the day. I came to use Mark because he was a friend of Frank Donahue's. He was an urchin diver and a Vietnam combat vet. I didn't know it until Mark told me some months later that he'd killed 2 guys and he was wanted for their murders. He had met a woman whose ex-boyfriend didn't want to let her go. The boyfriend and his brother had tried to kill Mark in an ambush. It failed, and they paid with their lives. How he walked out of the cop shop that day is a mystery to me. As far as I know, he was never caught. We arrive at a fabulous mansion in Hollywood owned by a guy who had a warehouse full of props he supplied to the movie industry. The girls were as mad as hornets. They asked Beth how she could be involved in something like this. Charlie went in the bedroom with them and started talking. At 3 a.m, everything was resolved. The girls had reasonable explanations for everything they had done. They were in contact with the pastor for counseling about their father. The girls actually felt sorry for us for being duped by their father. They had no ill will toward us. We were thrilled because apparently we were not going to be executed for kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment. Quack, quack. For some strange and unexplainable reason, Beth became pregnant. We decided that Los Angeles was not a place we wanted to bring up a kid, so we got in the Riviera and drove to New York. My father had some land a couple miles from the family farm. The property bordered the same river. He told me he had material to build a house, and if I wanted to build one, I could. When we got there, he was living in a trailer. There was another little travel trailer parked right on the river. Beth and I moved in there. It was a beautiful setting in a depressed area. There was no work. So I became a fairy tale character, a poor woodcutter. Most of the property was woodland. I would take a chainsaw and fell a couple trees. I'd buck the logs and branches into firewood. I'd split the wood by hand with a maul, load it into the truck, and deliver it. Father had an ad in the local paper, so we were busy. We got $200 a cord. It was hardly a living for 3 people. As always, my father looked at me as free labor. There was no time or money to build a house, and when the geese came in their multitudes in the fall and settled on the river, their honking made sleep impossible. An all-night cocktail party. My daughter was born, and we moved into an apartment at a little marina just down the river. My mother left L.A. with my nephew to go to Florida to see her ailing mother. The boy was about 10, quite a handful for my mother. She asked Beth and I if I would take care of him. We agreed, and he came to live with us in New York. There was no work around, so I went back to sea. This time I got a job on the East Coast, sailing out of Halifax, Nova Scotia. The boat was called the Arcadian Commander, a newly built 300-foot vessel with a crew of 30. That job was like being a real sailor. In 90 days, there was no dock time at all. Resupply was done by helicopter or ship. At that time, an American ship could sail in Canadian waters if they carried 25% Canadian crew. Our Canadians were all Newfoundlanders, who called themselves Newfies. Apparently in Canada at the time, the Newfies were the butt of the Canadian jokes. For example, how do Newfies make love? The Newfie replies, "And you think we're stupid?" We sailed off Sable Island in the North Atlantic that summer. It was gray, foggy, and chilly. The Newfies claimed that they didn't tan, they rusted. Sable Island lies 180 miles off Nova Scotia. It's a crescent sand dune, 26 miles long by a mile wide. Wild horses have lived there since the 1700s. Now they are a unique type, and they're found nowhere else. After that job, we moved to the Capital District of New York. I went back to training with my original sensei 3 times a week. I made my living as a stonemason, building walls, walks, water features, fireplaces, anything in stone. I've always thought it best to be a niche player. I could be a landscaper. All you need is a pickup truck and a wheelbarrow, but there's lots of landscapers. I gravitated to stonework because for every 50 landscapers, there's only 1 stonemason. As time went on, it became difficult to find good stone. The few stone yards around charged a fortune. I lived on the Hudson Valley Formation. It's a geological structure that contains a number of different sedimentary rocks. It originated in the Middle Devonian Age, some 350 million years ago, give or take. There is Beecraft limestone, which may metamorphosize into limestone in many millions of years. There's varieties of bluestone and a fossil rock known as Oriskany sandstone. All this stone was originally seafloor that was formed thousands of miles away. Tectonic plate activity brought it north to New York over millions of years. I believe there are about 14 different types of brachiopods that make up fossil rock. The stone is made of seashells. It contains big univalve the size of your hand, the same type of creature as an abalone, and there are giant snails the size of your fist. Imagine, one day, 360 million years ago, you're minding your own business, just sucking on seawater, and in an instant, you're buried alive. No more oxygen for you. You could see the fossilized flesh of these shells. They died in place, just like the Vesuvians. Well, it isn't called the Devonian extinction for nothing. At that time, there were only plants living on the land. Sea creatures had just begun to sprout legs. I guess anything that lived at that time is extinct today. Whenever I handled 300-million-year-old stone, I would think about the phrase the Romans inscribed on their sundials. Enjoy yourself. It's later than you think. The Hudson Valley Formation has supplied stone to the country for centuries. Before the invention of big trucks that could haul concrete, bluestone was used for curbing and sidewalks. New York City, Philadelphia, Washington, and Boston were all paved and curbed with bluestone from New York and Pennsylvania. I found an old quarry on a farmer's property. Our deal was I would pay him $5 a ton for any stone I took off the property. I moved south of Albany to get closer to the quarry. I bought a Ford backhoe and started quarrying new stone as well as selling the wall stone that was left in the spoils piles from the original quarry. The quarry produced wall stone, veneer, and curbing. After I dug the new stone, I would use my sledgehammer to break the stone into appropriate sizes and load the bucket of the backhoe. I would get 2.5 tons in each bucket. I would take the bucket to the loading area, dump it, come back for another. I would load 20 ton in the morning and 20 ton in the afternoon. It was biblically hard work. By that time, I had been promoted to 3rd-degree black belt, and Sensei T asked me to open a school in my town. There were only 40,000 people in my county, but I had a school that sustained itself for a decade. I shared a dojo with a judo teacher. I had 3 classes, Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday. Judo was on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I would drive south an hour and train with Sensei S on Thursdays. There were a couple of prisons nearby, and I offered classes to the correction officers. I taught them techniques to restrain the inmates without hurting them. Eventually, I would operate 3 different quarries. The work was not only brutally hard. The stone quarry was where the ancients sent their enemies to die, but it was apparently unconstitutionally hard. I found out from the corrections officers that they had work release programs. I called the prison to see if I could get prisoners to help me to do what I did every day. I was informed that that type of work was cruel and unusual, and by law, murderers and rapists could not be compelled to do it. I was crushed to learn I had an un-American occupation. I never thought of my life as cruel and unusual. Well, maybe unusual, but never cruel. At that time, I met a guy, Big Don. He was about 20 years old. Omar was big, but Don was NFL big, 6'5" and 320. Don was not only big, he was incredibly strong. He worked as a skip tracer for an auto repossession company. He was an ace at locating people and repoing cars. It's illegal to create a public disturbance in an effort to repossess a vehicle. Don was after a Lamborghini. The car was kept in a garage on gated property in the country. Don came up with a couple of hazmat suits from somewhere and put together a plan to get the Lamborghini. He had some helpers from the repo company. One surveilled the house and let him know when the Lamborghini left. Once the car leaves, Don and company roll up the owner's gate. He sends a lookout a couple miles down the road to watch for the car's return. Don and another guy put on a hazmat suit. When the lookout spots the Lamborghini, he signals Don. They have maybe 2 minutes before the Lamborghini arrives. Right before the car owner's gate, he puts up an orange and white sawhorse blockade. Don's father was in construction. He borrowed one of the white pickup trucks with a yellow dome light on the roof. He pulled the pickup truck to the barricade. Out of the pickup truck and onto the road, they roll a 55-gallon drum. The drum is painted yellow and has hazardous material stickers all over it. It's about 1/3 filled with water. They open it and let the water run onto the road. Don also has a cargo van parked on the other side of the road so that at this point it's completely blocked off. The driver gets in the van. As the Lamborghini owner approaches his gate, he sees the road blocked. There's 2 guys in hazmat suits, and one of them is waving him down. There's a barrel on the road leaking something, and the yellow hazmat light flashing on the top of the pickup truck. The Lamborghini pulls up 15 feet from the barrel, 5 feet from the water. The driver rolls down his window. Don tells him that this is a hazardous material emergency. The puddle he sees in front of him is deadly. His lookout is on the walkie-talkie reading a script. The wind is veering to the north. Situation is becoming more unstable. More cleanup may be necessary. All personnel must evacuate as quickly as possible. The driver can hear all this coming out of Don's walkie-talkie. Don tells him, don't turn off the car. Don tells him first priority is get the driver to safety. He wants them to take a deep breath, get out of the car, and into the van as quickly as possible. Once he's in the van, he'll be taken a safe distance away. The guy gets out and into the van. The van drives away. The boys strip out of their hazmat suits and load all their props into the back of the truck. And off they go with no trace left behind but a wet spot on the road. The whole operation was over in minutes. Don was pissed that he was too big for the Lamborghini. A normal-sized human drove it away. Once the car was gone, Don contacted the van to bring the owner home. When the van arrived, Don told him that his car had been repossessed. Have a good day. The owner squawked a lot, but there was nothing he could do about it. Over the next 20 years, Big Don and I would pull many capers. He evolved from a skip racer to a bounty hunter. In the parlance, an operator. We often had ex-Navy SEALs and other spooky fellows working with us. He started bounty hunting because he was so good at finding people, and there was more money in finding fugitives than finding cars. Bounty hunters work for the bail bondsman. If you get charged with a crime, the amount of bail will be set depending on the severity of the crime. Let's say you carjack someone and your bail is set at $100,000. You have to come up with 10% of that money in cash or property. You pay that 10% to the bail bondsman. He in turn pays the court the full $100,000. That 10% is gone. That's the price you pay for the bondsman to put up the other $90,000. If you regularly show up for your hearings until the process is done, the bail bondsman gets his $100,000 back. If you don't show up to court, a bench warrant is issued for your arrest. If the bail bondsman can't produce you in a year's time, the whole $100,000 is forfeit to the court. That means the bail bondsman is out $90,000. That's why bail bondsmen hire bail enforcement agents, bounty hunters. Traditionally, bounty hunters got 10% of the value of the bond. People that got out of jail with a $10,000, $20,000, $25,000 bail didn't have the police going to their houses looking for them. On occasion, police did go out and serve warrants, but it wasn't an everyday occurrence. More often than not, you'd get caught at a traffic stop where they would check your license for wants and warrants. This is why low bail skips could be found at home or even at their girlfriends' houses. Don worked out of a Jeep, a Grand Cherokee, and he carried a shotgun 9mm. Don would go to the local bail bondsman, go through his warrants looking for skips that were geographically close together. Don would call the local cops as a courtesy and let them know he was working in their area. Don would go to an address, take a shotgun to the front door, and knock. Once the door was open, he would forcibly enter and search the house for the skip. Legally, he had the power to break and enter into a dwelling if he believed the fugitive was inside. If he found the skip, he put him in the Cherokee, handcuff him to a custom-made rail, and drive to the next address. If the skip wasn't at that address, Don would question, with gun in hand, whoever was there and get the fugitive's whereabouts. Sometimes these people were very cooperative. It might be a pissed-off girlfriend. It might be a mother or a father had put their house up for bail and would lose it if their son didn't go to court. If the person was uncooperative, Don would intimidate or threaten the person with harboring a fugitive, which was a felony. Once Don made it clear that it was in the person's best interest to cooperate, he would have the person call the fugitive on the phone and find out where he was. Depending on how reliable Don judged the person to be, one of two things would happen. Don would leave, making sure the person knew there'd be a heavy penalty if the fugitive wasn't at the address he was given. Or two, if Don thought the person might call the fugitive back to warn him, he would load the person up in the Cherokee, handcuff him, and take him with him. Don hated to go back to the bail bondsman with less than 4 skips in the Cherokee. Sometimes he had so many they'd have to sit on each other's laps. At a minimum, $1,000 a head, Don was making good money. If Don had tracked down a really bad guy, someone wanted for assault with a deadly weapon or murder, he would enlist the police as backup. They were happy to be part of the capture of a killer. In one incident, Don came under fire from the fugitive and had to kill him. Sometimes, instead of chasing these guys, Don would use a fishing technique. Since he had the addresses of all the skips, he would send them official-looking winter notifications. They'd won a boat. They could pick it up on Saturday at the American Legion Post. Don's father had 4 brothers. All 5 of them served in the Second World War. The American Legion Post was named after them. Don could use it whenever he wanted to. One of the post's members had a new boat. They parked it out at the front entry. He also had help from a half a dozen of the post's old soldiers. Don set up a table inside the front door. When a man arrived with his winter's notice in hand, he was greeted at the table by Don and one of the vets. Don would ask him for his driver's license. Once his ID was verified, Don would ask him to come to the post office to sign ownership papers. Once he was inside the office, Don would throw him on the floor roughly and cuff him. He was then taken to another room where he was watched by some other old soldiers. Don had $15,000 Saturdays. He would kick some of the money back to the post. The vets loved it so much, and they wanted to do it every week. On one of these fishing expeditions, unbeknownst to him, he captured a fugitive for the U.S. Marshal Service. They were looking for him, and there was a $25,000 reward on him. Don found out about this when the Marshal Services called him about collecting his reward. That started a long, unofficial association with the Marshal Service. Don also made contacts in the FBI. Bounty hunting is only legal in the United States and the Philippines. Everywhere else, you can be imprisoned or shot. The marshals had a long list of bad guys that were outside the country. Often they knew right where they were, but they had no jurisdiction to pursue them. The rewards on some of these guys was hundreds of thousands, plus private rewards were also posted by families and foundations. Unofficially, Don went after some of the marshals' fugitives. There was a cop killer in a non-extradition country, namely Cuba. Don went there, found him, and surveilled him for a few days. The fugitive was in the habit of drinking his morning coffee on a park bench a block from his house. One morning, while he was doing this, Don, dressed in the whites of a male nurse, approached him, pushing a wheelchair. He carried a milk-shaped cup with a mixture of DMSO and ketamine. DMSO is a penetrative vehicle for other drugs that can be absorbed right through the skin. Ketamine is an anesthetic that will incapacitate you physically and mentally. Don said, "Good morning," and spilled the milkshake cup on the fugitive's arm. Within minutes, he had him loaded into the wheelchair. Don rolled him back to his house, where he packed a small bag and got the fugitive's passport. He dosed him once more on the flight back to Miami. When they landed, he left him drooling in a restroom before customs. He cleared customs and called the marshals, who called the airport cops to pick up their guy. Don got a big reward, and the marshals got their man, unofficially. On a similar job, Don went to Mexico to apprehend the brother of a cartel boss. They operated out of a village that was on the top of a mountain. Only one road went into the village. Don had hired a local Mexican as a guide and interpreter. The guide knew the village, and he drove Don there. As they started to climb up the mountain to the village, they came upon some local Indians. The Indians were going up to the village to trade. Through his interpreter, Don tried to gather what intel he could about the village. The Indios said it was a place of bad men, but they were wealthy, so they had many different things to trade. Don made a few trades with them, and the Indians proceeded up the mountain. They get to the village and find it fairly typical. There were a few guns present, but this was the cartel. For their home turf, things seemed relaxed. Unlike the movies where there's armament wall to wall, this is real life. How are you going to pull this off and live to tell the tale? He's no good to Don dead. He has to be captured. Don's strategy was just go do it. They go to the unofficial address, a hotel in the middle of town. The hotel has a parking lot in the back. No guards or guns are visible. Don and his driver drive around the back, and they park as close to the rear entry as possible, with the car facing out and the trunk open. If his intel is correct, he has the right room number on the first floor. He grabs his backpack and goes in the rear entry. No one is present in the hallway. He takes a taser, 2 zip ties, and a roll of duct tape out of his backpack. He goes to the room, knocks on the door. His fugitive answers the door, talking on a cell phone. He appears to be alone, and Don tases him. He goes down, and the phone goes flying. Don instantly zip ties his hands and feet. He seals his mouth with duct tape and starts taping his arms to his sides. There's a rug on the floor, which is the perfect size. Don rolls him up and duct tapes him in it. Don't forget, Don is almost 200 pounds heavier than this guy. To Don, it would be like dealing with a child. Don throws the carpet over his shoulder and heads for the car. He gets there and throws the guy in the trunk. The driver heads out of the parking lot to the main street. If they turn left, they drive by the hotel and to the road that leaves out of town. A right takes them farther away from their exit. When they get to the main street, they look to the left and see a cop car with its flashing lights and 2 black Hummers approaching. Don goes right. They can see the road is closed behind them as the vehicles converge at the hotel. Don thought that whoever the fugitive was talking to must have called the cavalry. Maybe it was his brother. Don knows the only way out of town will be closed. While he mulls over his situation, they drive to the far end of town and park. He's trapped on the top of a mountain. The cartel and their policemen, probably everybody in the village, is going to be looking for him, looking for what he's got in his trunk. He could dump the guy, but if he puts him in plain sight, he may not get down the mountain. If he hides him, the way he's cocooned and gagged, he'll probably die before he's found. There's no good option, but apparently there are angels. 50 feet from Don, out of the bush, come the Indians he had met at the bottom of the hill an hour ago. They were more than happy to forsake their trading and carry a carpet back down the hill for the price Don offered. Don and his guide headed down the hill. Their vehicle was searched at the roadblock, and they were free to go. Apparently, no one had seen him or his vehicle during the snatch. That's the way we do it. Don met the Indians at the bottom of the hill, got his man, and got paid. Dear listener, if you have enjoyed this episode, please share it. A 5-star review on Spotify or wherever you listen would be greatly appreciated. You can follow me and my Mastiff, Drax the Destroyer, on the It's in the Blood Facebook page. Or you can send me an email at jesse.it'sintheblood@gmail.com. Thank you so much for your support.